She had survived 2 years running, changed her name 3 times, moved to 4 different cities. She had learned to eat cold food, sleep with one eye open, and never let her guard down long enough to feel something real. Then one word destroyed everything she had built. One single word, barely above a whisper, slipped past her teeth before she could catch it. Baby. And the most dangerous man in New York City went completely, terrifyingly still. This is the story of a woman who thought she was invisible, and the man who had already memorized every breath she took. If this story reaches you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this goes. Hit like. Stay till the end. You won't regret it. The Obsidian Club didn't appear on any tourist map. It didn't have a Yelp page, a social media account, or a sign above the door that meant anything to ordinary people. What it had was a matte black facade on West 54th Street that looked like the entrance to a building that had forgotten it existed, and a doorman named Carl who never smiled, never spoke, and remembered every face that had ever tried to walk past him uninvited. Noelle Hart had gotten the job through a woman named Patrice, a veteran cocktail waitress with bad knees and worse taste in men who'd slipped her a laminated card with nothing but a phone number printed in silver ink. Don't ask how I got it, Patrice had said, lighting her 3rd cigarette of the hour. Just call. Tell them Patrice Duval sent you. Wear something black. Keep your eyes down and your mouth shut. She'd paused, studying Noelle's face like she was reading something written there in a language most people couldn't see. You look like you need somewhere to disappear. She wasn't wrong. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of learning the rhythms of a place that operated on its own set of laws. Laws that had nothing to do with the ones printed in courthouses. The Obsidian Club served men who owned courthouses. Men who owned the judges inside them. Men whose names appeared in newspapers only when their publicists allowed it, and whose real work was conducted in rooms where no recording device would ever survive long enough to matter. Noelle moved through those rooms like smoke. She'd learned fast. You didn't make eye contact with the men at table 4 unless you wanted the kind of attention that didn't end when the check was paid. You refilled the scotch at table 7 before it hit the halfway mark, because the silver-haired senator from Connecticut got irritable when he had to wait, and irritable senators said things that made everyone in earshot uncomfortable. You never repeated anything you heard, not to coworkers, not to the bartender, not even to yourself in the silence of your own apartment, because some things were safer left inside a room that could swallow them. She was good at not being remembered. It was the one skill she had cultivated with something close to artistry. Her real name wasn't Noelle Hart. She'd built that name from pieces. Noelle from a street sign she'd passed during a December ice storm in Pittsburgh. Hart from the maiden name of a grandmother she'd met exactly twice. The name she'd been born with was folded inside a gym bag under her bed, tucked between a burner phone with a dead battery and $3,000 in cash she'd been adding to for over 2 years. Not because she was planning to run again, because she needed to know she could. She had a system. Clock in at 9. Keep her hair pinned back, no loose strands to catch light or attention. Smile when necessary. Not a real smile, but the professional approximation of one, the kind that said, I'm here, I'm competent, I don't exist outside this room. Clock out before the late crowd thickened. Walk home via 3 different routes on rotation, never the same one twice in a week. Lock the door. Check the lock. Check it again. Sleep like a woman waiting for something to go wrong. The problem with the Obsidian Club was that it rewarded invisibility right until the moment it didn't. Her regular assignment was the main floor, a sprawling, low-lit space of dark wood and leather, where deals were made in murmurs and everything smelled faintly of aged bourbon and expensive cologne. She knew those tables. She knew their habits, their preferred drinks, their unspoken rules about when to approach and when to stay back. The main floor was manageable because it was predictable, and predictability was the closest thing Noelle had to safety. The private floor was another matter entirely. It occupied the top level of the building, accessible only by a separate elevator requiring a magnetic keycard that wasn't given to ordinary staff. In 6 months, Noelle had never been up there. She hadn't wanted to be. She'd heard enough fragments, overheard enough lowered voices in the break room to understand that the private floor was a different category of place. The air was different up there, the other waitresses said. You couldn't hear the music from downstairs. You couldn't hear anything at all except the conversations happening in real time, which meant every word you said could be heard by the men sitting 20 feet away. Men who did not like to be heard, but were very good at listening. She found out she'd been assigned upstairs on a Tuesday night, 11 minutes before her shift started, when the club's floor manager, a thin, precise woman named Gloria, who wore her hair like a helmet and communicated primarily through controlled expressions, stopped her in the hallway outside the service entrance and handed her a different set of key cards without explanation. "Upstairs tonight," Gloria said. Noelle stared at the cards. "I've never worked the private floor." "I'm aware." "Then why—" "Kowalski called out sick. You're senior enough? Don't overthink it." Gloria was already turning away. "Stay quiet. Stay efficient. If anyone at table 1 speaks to you beyond placing an order, the appropriate response is to complete the order and say nothing else." "Table 1, Noelle repeated. Gloria paused without turning back. "Lucien Moretti's table, you've heard the name." It wasn't a question. Noelle had heard the name. Everyone who worked within 3 blocks of this building had heard the name, whether they knew it or not. He was the kind of name that existed in the gaps between conversations, mentioned, and then immediately softened, qualified, redirected, as if saying it too clearly might summon something. 36 years old, owner of record for 17 businesses across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Jersey Shore. Rumored owner of considerably more that didn't appear in any filing. The East Coast's most feared man in a tailored suit, sitting at a table in a room where sound didn't travel the wrong way. Noelle thought about the $3,000 under her bed. She thought about what running cost, and how many times she could afford to do it. Then she took the key cards and went upstairs. The private floor was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate. 8 tables, each set far enough apart that a conversation at normal volume couldn't reach the neighboring one. The lighting was warmer up here, almost amber, the kind of light that softened faces and blurred the hard edges of whatever was being negotiated. There was no music. Gloria had been right about that. The silence was complete in a way that felt intentional, engineered. 4 of the 8 tables were occupied. 3 of them she could process quickly. She took mental notes, registered faces she didn't recognize and had no intention of remembering, began mapping the rhythm of who needed what and when. Then she turned toward table 1. Lucien Moretti was not what she'd constructed in her mind. She'd built him from rumors, which meant she'd expected something operatic, the heavy-set caricature of power, loud and ornamented, the kind of man who made sure you knew who you were dealing with before you got close enough to shake his hand. That version existed in movies. It had almost nothing to do with the man sitting alone at the corner table with his jacket folded over the chair beside him, a glass of water, just water, half empty in front of him, and a document in his hands that he was reading with the focused attention of someone who did not intend to be interrupted. He was lean in the way that came from discipline rather than genetics. Dark hair, cut clean. A face that was striking without being conventionally handsome. Angular jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once. Dark eyes that, when they lifted from the document to register her approach, felt less like a gaze and more like an assessment being conducted at a speed too fast to follow. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the document. "Still water?" he said. "Same glass?" She refilled it. She did not introduce herself. She did not ask if everything was satisfactory. She turned and went back to the service station, and she told herself that was fine, that was good, that was exactly how she wanted it to go. She had not felt his eyes follow her across the room. But they had. The thing about Lucien Moretti, the thing that the rumors got wrong, the thing that no second-hand account quite managed to capture, was not the power he wielded or the fear he generated, or the empire of legitimate and illegitimate interests that bore his name in one form or another. The thing about him was the quality of his attention. He noticed details the way other men noticed nothing. A difference in posture, a micro-expression gone before it could be consciously processed. The specific way a person moved through a room when they thought no one was watching them. He had been watching Noelle Hart since she walked through the elevator doors. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the understated way of a woman who had gone to some effort to be overlooked. Not because of anything she said, since she said nothing beyond the absolute minimum required by her job, What caught his attention was the opposite of what usually caught his attention. She wasn't trying to be noticed by him. In 36 years, in a life that had placed him in rooms with powerful men and ambitious women and every permutation of human desire and calculation, Lucien had developed a particular kind of exhaustion with being seen as an asset, as something to be approached, charmed, impressed, leveraged. Every person who entered his orbit had an angle, even the ones who were skilled enough to hide it. He could feel it anyway, the slight forward lean of someone calculating a return on investment. This woman walked through his space like he wasn't in it, not aggressively, not with deliberate indifference, the kind of performance that was its own attempt at attention, just genuinely, practically, unconsciously, as if her whole focus was organized around a goal that had nothing to do with him. He found it genuinely disorienting. He watched her manage the rest of the floor with quiet efficiency, and he noticed the things she didn't do. She didn't overfill glasses to create opportunities to return to tables. She didn't slow her pace near conversations that weren't her business. She didn't clock the faces of the men in the room, didn't visibly register the names that floated occasionally into earshot. She did her job, and she moved like someone whose primary occupation was taking up as little space as possible. And she did it so well that by the time the shift was winding down, 2 of the other tables had already forgotten she existed. Lucien had not forgotten. He waited until the room had thinned to 2 other occupied tables before he spoke to her again. "You're new to this floor." She was refilling the water, the same glass, 4th time. And she didn't startle, which impressed him. Most people, when he addressed them unexpectedly, betrayed at least a half-second of something. She just completed the refill and straightened and met his eyes with a steadiness that was either very well trained or very real. "Yes," she said. "First night. You've been on the main floor." It wasn't a question. She decided to treat it like one anyway. 6 months. He looked at her for another one of those 3-second assessments. Then he looked back at the document. "You can go." She went. In the elevator on the way down, she realized her hands were completely steady. She looked at them like they belonged to someone else. In the past 2 years, she had met exactly 3 men who frightened her enough that her hands did that involuntary thing where they stopped trusting her. Lucien Moretti made 4, but it wasn't the fear itself that unsettled her. It was the fact that it was different from the fear she was used to. Elias Crane's fear had been the kind that made you want to disappear. Lucien Moretti's fear made her want to understand why she was feeling it. She didn't go back upstairs for the rest of the week. The regular schedule reassigned her to the main floor, and she accepted this with the specific relief of someone stepping back from a ledge they hadn't meant to approach. She told herself she'd handled it well, done the job, said nothing unnecessary, attracted no attention. Exactly what she was supposed to do. She didn't tell herself about the way she'd thought of his eyes twice in the span of a single Tuesday night, both times in the dark, both times in the specific silence of a mind that was trying very hard to stay empty. The temporary assignment came 2 weeks later. One of Lucien's mid-level restaurants, a legitimate establishment called Carver's, a sleek Italian-American place in the meatpacking district that was known publicly for its wine list and privately for being the place where a particular class of business was occasionally conducted over long dinners, had lost 2 servers to a stomach flu that swept through the kitchen staff on a Thursday afternoon. Gloria brought it to Noel during a 5-minute break between the lunch rush and the early dinner setup. "It's a 4-day fill, union rate plus gratuity. Carver's runs different from here, more civilian, less quiet," Noel offered. Gloria's mouth made a shape that might have been the beginning of a smile. "More civilian," she repeated. "You'd report to a man named Soren. He runs the floor there. All you need to know is that it's connected to this property, so the same discretion applies." Noel thought about it for about 4 seconds. She said yes because the money was real and the money mattered, and because saying no to Gloria twice in 2 weeks felt like the kind of pattern that got you noticed. She reported to Carver's the following Monday. It was, as Gloria had described, more civilian. The clientele was mixed. Genuine restaurant patrons seated beside men whose conversations required the white noise of the city around them to feel private. The staff was larger, the pace different, the pressure distributed in a way that felt almost normal. Noel settled into it quickly, found the rhythm, found the spots where she could be efficient without being visible. She did not see Lucien Moretti for the first 3 days. On the fourth day, he came in through the service entrance at 6:15 in the evening before the dinner rush, accompanied by a man Noelle didn't recognize and a tension in the room that arrived ahead of both of them. Soren redirected 2 tables without explanation. A server named Marcus found somewhere else to be without being told. Noelle was carrying a tray of water glasses to table 12 when she registered the shift in the room's atmosphere and looked up and found him already seated in the back booth, jacket on this time, already talking in low tones to the man across from him. She kept moving. Did table 12. Kept her back to his booth and her attention on the work. She was back at the service station, hands occupied with a coffee order, when she heard the voice of the man with Lucien rise slightly. Not loud, not aggressive, but enough to cross the ambient noise of the room. And she caught 3 words without meaning to. Not acceptable anymore. Then Lucien's voice, much quieter, a reply she couldn't catch. Then the man again, sharper. You don't understand what he's capable of. And then silence, complete and sudden, the way silence fell when someone in a room like this decided to create it on purpose. She didn't look. She focused on the coffee. She was almost done with the order when Soren materialized at her elbow and tilted his head toward the back booth. Take them water. She looked at him. Just water, he said. The other gentleman looks like he needs something to do with his hands. Noelle took a breath that was steadier than she felt. She put a small tray together, 2 glasses, pitcher, moved through the restaurant with her shoulders level, and her face neutral, and her mind doing the very specific trick she'd spent 2 years perfecting, the trick of making the present moment so purely procedural that there was no room in it for anything else. She reached the booth. She set the first glass in front of the man across from Lucien, middle-aged, sweat at his temples, hands that were gripping the edge of the table like it was the last solid surface in a tilting world. She reached across to set the second glass. And then the man said something, low and urgent, directed at Lucien. And something about a name. Not Elias. Not that name, just a name. But the specific cadence of it was the cadence of a threat being delivered, and it pulled at something in Noelle's chest that she hadn't known was still wired, some circuit that had been buried under 2 years of careful numbering, and her hand moved. The glass and her mouth moved before she could catch it, the word rising from somewhere below conscious thought, below the careful architecture of who she had decided to be. Baby. It came out barely above a whisper. She caught it almost immediately, clamped down, finished placing the glass on the table and straightened and kept her face completely, deliberately still. The man across from Lucien hadn't heard it. He was still looking at Lucien. But Lucien had gone very quiet. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She turned to go. Wait. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. She turned back, looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not amusement, not the assessment she'd seen before. Something else. Something slower. What was that? He said. Nothing, she said. I apologize for the interruption. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes moved briefly to the man across from him. Give us a minute, Marco. Marco looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't. He slid out of the booth and walked toward the front of the restaurant with the slightly dazed posture of a man who had been dismissed and was still processing the mechanics of how it had happened. Noelle stood at the edge of the booth. Her tray was in her hands. Her face was still. Underneath that stillness, her heart was doing something she could feel in her throat. Sit down, Lucien said. I'm working, she said. I'm aware. He looked at the empty seat across from him. Sit down. She sat. He looked at her without speaking for long enough that she had time to calculate exactly how many exits this restaurant had and how long it would take her to reach each of them, and then he said very quietly, Nobody speaks to me that way. She opened her mouth. I'm not finished, he said. It wasn't harsh. It was just final. Nobody speaks to me that way. Not in 6 years. Not in any room I've been in. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. You weren't talking to me. No, she said. I wasn't. It was a mistake. It won't happen again. What was it? A reflex, she said. An old one. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. Who taught you to look like that? He said. She blinked. Like what? Like you're already deciding which window to go through. Her throat closed. She made it open again. Mr. Moretti, she said, I need to get back to work. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he sat back in the booth and picked up his water glass and looked away, which was the clearest form of dismissal she had seen since arriving in this city. She walked back to the service station on legs that felt borrowed. She set the tray down on the counter and stood with her hands flat on the surface and stared at the wall. The 4-day fill was supposed to end tomorrow. She would go back to the Obsidian Club's main floor. She would reestablish her rhythm. She would forget the specific way his eyes had looked at her when she'd said that word. Not angry, not cold, just suddenly, intensely, completely awake. She could still feel it. The quality of being seen by someone who actually knew how to look. She stayed at the service station long enough to get her breathing back to something that felt normal. She didn't see Lucian leave. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, standing there with her hands flat on that counter in the back room of a restaurant that belonged to him, was that he sat in that booth for 11 more minutes after she walked away, the water untouched, Marco eventually drifting back to the seat across from him, saying something about the conversation they'd been having before. Lucian said nothing. He was thinking about a word that had no business being directed at him, a word that had slipped out of a woman who looked at exits the way other people looked at lifelines, a woman who moved through rooms like she was practicing disappearing, a woman who had just looked at him with the most undisguised, uncalculated, unperformed terror he had seen on a human face in years. And underneath the terror, this was the part that stayed with him, the part that was still turning in his chest when he finally stood and put on his jacket and told Marco to reschedule the conversation for next week. Underneath all of it, there had been something else, something exhausted and worn and real in a way that most things he encountered in his world had long stopped being. He told his driver to take the long route home. He sat in the back of the car and watched the city go by and said nothing, and the city had no idea that its most dangerous resident had just been undone by a single, accidental word spoken by a woman who didn't even know his first name. She had no idea what she'd started. By morning, there were 2 additional security cameras covering the block where she lived, and none of them pointed at anything she would ever notice. She slept badly. That wasn't new. What was new was the specific texture of it, the way she kept surfacing from shallow, broken sleep, not with the old nightmare, Elias's hands on her wrists, the sound a door made when it was locked from the outside, but with something quieter and harder to name, a pair of dark eyes, the quality of attention behind them, the particular silence of a man who had asked her to sit down and then simply watched her, like he was reading something she hadn't intended to write. She was awake by 4:30. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the city outside her window, cab horns, a drunk somewhere laughing too hard, the irregular percussion of a city that never fully stopped. And she ran the previous evening through her head with the methodical deliberateness of someone reviewing security footage, looking for the moment she'd made the mistake that was going to cost her something. The word baby. 2 syllables. The kind of word that, in another life, had meant warmth, had meant the shorthand of intimacy between 2 people who had chosen each other. She'd said it to exactly 2 men in her life, and one of them had eventually used that tenderness as a blueprint for control, had learned exactly which soft parts of her to press against when he wanted her compliance. She hadn't said it again in 2 years. She'd thought she'd burned it out of herself. Apparently not. She sat up, put her feet on the cold floor, and told herself it was fine. Lucian Moretti was a powerful man with larger concerns than a waitress with a bad reflex. He would have moved on to whatever came next in the life of a man like that. She was a 4-day fill who'd gone back to her regular rotation. She was nobody. She was nothing to him. She almost believed it. She was making coffee when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The position at Carver's has been extended. Report to Soren by 5 p.m. today. Gee, she stared at the message long enough for her coffee to start going cold. Gloria never texted from unknown numbers. Gloria communicated through the club's internal scheduling system, a system that was unglamorous and outdated and had been in use since before Noelle was hired. In 6 months, Gloria had contacted her through the system every single time. Noelle typed back, "Why the change in schedule?" The reply came in under a minute. "Management decision, not mine to explain." She set the phone face down on the counter and stood there in her kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light, thinking about exits. She went back to Carver's. She told herself it was because she needed the money, which was true. She told herself it was because refusing would attract more attention than complying, which was also true. She did not tell herself the third thing, the one that sat at the back of her chest and wouldn't be named. Soren was waiting when she arrived at 4:50, clipboard in hand, the expression of a man who managed the visible portion of an iceberg for a living and had learned not to wonder too hard about the rest of it. "You're back," he said. "Apparently," she said. "Kitchen's running short on the duck tonight. If table 6 asks, push the lamb." He was already moving. "Floor's yours from the back half, standard rotation." She tied her apron and went to work. 2 hours into the dinner service, she was running a breadbasket to table 9 when she saw him. He was at the back booth again, same position. Jacket on, this time, which she was learning meant something, though she didn't yet know exactly what. The man across from him was different from Marco. Younger, shorter, a face that was professionally blank in the way of someone who had been trained to show nothing, which itself showed quite a lot. They were not speaking when she noticed them. They were both looking at a photograph laid flat on the table between them, and the quality of the silence between them was the kind that had weight. She delivered the bread. She did not look back. She made it another 40 minutes before Soren found her at the service station and tilted his head toward the back in the same gesture as before, and she thought, of course. This time she didn't wait to be told twice. She put together the water tray and went. The younger man left the booth before she arrived. He didn't look at her as he passed. The photograph was gone from the table. She set the water in front of Lucien. He didn't acknowledge the glass. "Sit," he said. "Mr. Moretti is—" "Sit down, please." The please surprised her enough that she sat. He looked at her across the table with those dark, assessing eyes, and then he said, "You've been on edge since you walked in tonight." "I'm always on edge," she said, before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, a recognition. "How long?" he said. "How long what?" "Have you been whatever you are right now?" She looked at the table. "I don't know what that means." "Yes, you do." Her jaw tightened. "I'm a waitress. I've been a waitress since—" "That's not what I asked." She looked up at him. There was no performance in his face, no angle she could identify. He was just watching her with the same focused patience he probably applied to everything, the kind of patience that didn't feel kind so much as it felt accurate, a precision instrument rather than an open hand. 2 years, she said before she could stop herself. Then, "I don't know what I'm answering." 2 years of what? Of managing. He was quiet for a moment. Managing what? She looked at him directly and said nothing, and the nothing was its own answer, and they both knew it. Lucien sat back slightly. He picked up the water glass and turned it once in his hand, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as the way he occupied himself while thinking. "The position at Carver's," he said. "It's not temporary anymore." She went still. "The restaurant needed experienced floor staff," he continued. "The arrangement makes logistical sense." "Did you arrange it?" she asked. He didn't answer that directly. He set the glass down. "The pay is better than the club rate. The hours are more predictable." He met her eyes. "You'd be free to decline." The word free sat between them in a way she suspected he understood exactly. "Why?" she said. "I told you. Logistical? Why me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not much, barely perceptible, but she was getting better at reading the small things because in her experience the small things were where the truth lived. "Because you're good at your job," he said, "and because you're not afraid of me in the way that makes people useless." She stared at him. "I am afraid of you." "I know," he said, "but you sat down anyway." She didn't have an answer for that. He didn't seem to need one. She went home that night with the job offer turning in her head like a stone in a river, wearing itself smooth and strange. She should say no. Every instinct she had, the instincts that had been sharpened over 2 years of staying alive by staying small, said no. Proximity to a man like Lucien Moretti was the opposite of invisible. It was the opposite of safe. But she was so tired. Not afraid tired, just tired. The specific exhaustion of a person who had been maintaining a performance for so long that they'd forgotten what they'd been before it started. She said yes in the morning, by text, to a number Soren provided. She told herself it was practical. She spent the first week at Carver's waiting for something to happen. Something always happened. In her experience, men who offered you things without visible strings still had strings. They just waited for the right moment to show them. Nothing happened. Her walk home was uneventful. Her apartment stayed the way she left it. Nobody appeared in the margins of her daily life with the particular quality of attention that meant she was being observed or tracked or prepared for. She checked the 3 locks on her door every night and went to bed and slept marginally better than she had in months, which she refused to examine too closely. She saw Lucien 4 more times in that first week. Each time he was present in the restaurant in the way that things at the center of a gravitational field were present, not moving dramatically, not announcing themselves, but organizing the space around them in ways that didn't need explanation. Each time she brought water. Each time he said something brief and non-performative, not charm, not warmth exactly. Just a kind of direct contact that bypassed all the social machinery she had learned to hide behind. On Thursday, he said, "You changed your walking route." She set the water down, kept her face neutral. "Excuse me?" "The route you take home. From here." He didn't look up from the document in his hands. "You changed it Tuesday. You took 11th instead of going up 9th. Her pulse was very calm. She had trained it to be. "How do you know what route I take?" It was not a question. She didn't have the breath to make it a question. He looked up then. "Because I pay attention," he said simply. "And because 9th Avenue has had 2 incidents in the past 3 weeks that didn't make local news for reasons that aren't worth explaining." She stared at him. "Tuesday's route was smarter," he said, and looked back at the document. She walked back to the service station. She stood there for a moment with her hands around a water pitcher that wasn't particularly cold and thought about what it meant that a man who ran half the East Coast had noticed her walking route with enough specificity to comment on its change. She thought about the security cameras she hadn't known to look for. She thought about the way the aggressive regular from the Obsidian Club's main floor, a sweaty investment type named Hargrove, who had a habit of touching Waitress's wrists when he ordered, had simply stopped coming in around the time she'd taken the Carver's position. She didn't ask Lucien about any of it. She was afraid of what the asking would cost. The first real confrontation happened on a Friday. There was a man named Caruso who occupied table 7 most Friday evenings. Mid-50s, expensive watch, the confident bearing of someone accustomed to service of all varieties and not particularly concerned about the humanity of whoever was providing it. He'd been cordial enough in the first 2 weeks. That Friday, he was 3 whiskeys in before the appetizers arrived, and when Noelle brought the bread, he closed his hand around her wrist. Not hard, not violently, just casually, the way you might rest your hand on a railing. "You're the one who replaced Margot," he said. She looked at his hand on her wrist. Her face was completely still. "I need you to let go," she said, at a volume intended only for him. "Margot used to stay and talk a little," he said, like she hadn't spoken. "You're prettier than Margot." "Sir?" Still quiet, still. "Let go." He held on another 2 seconds. Not long, but long enough to make the point he was trying to make, which was that he could, and then released her. She walked back to the service station, set the bread tray down, breathed once. She was resetting her tray when she realized the quality of the room had changed. She looked up and found Soren moving quickly toward table 7 with the controlled urgency of someone responding to a situation rather than a social call. And 2 of Lucien's men, she'd learned to identify them by their particular stillness and the way they occupied corners, materializing near the entrance. Caruso was gone by the time Noelle looked toward his table. Not gone like he'd excused himself. Gone like the table had been quietly and efficiently cleared of him, his whiskey, his expensive watch, and all the casual confidence that came with it. She found out later he wouldn't be returning. She did not ask how that had been arranged. She was learning to not ask about certain things. What she did do, the following Monday, was wait in the back hallway of the restaurant until she knew Lucien was in the building, and then she walked directly to the back booth without being summoned and sat down across from him. He looked up from his phone. "The man on Friday," she said. He waited. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "He put his hands on my staff. I handled it." "I know you did." His voice was level. "I handled the rest." "That's not—" She stopped, tried again. "I'm not yours to handle." Something moved through his expression. Not anger, not offense. Closer to recognition, and underneath that, something that might have been pain if she'd looked long enough to be sure. "I'm aware," he said. "Then why?" "Because I wanted to," he said. "Not because I had the right to." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away. He didn't dress it up or walk it back or give her the kind of explanation that was really a performance of reasonableness. He just said what was true and let it sit there. "I need you to ask me first," she said finally, "before you do things like that. I need to be in the conversation." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Agreed." She didn't fully believe it, but she sat with the word for a second before she stood, and it didn't feel entirely empty, which was more than she was used to. 2 more weeks passed. The job solidified into routine. She was good at routine. She'd rebuilt herself out of it. She knew the kitchen's rhythm at Carver's, knew the supply delivery schedule, knew which tables were reserved for Lucian's people on which nights. She knew Soren took his coffee without sugar and kept antacids in his breast pocket, and was in the process of a quiet divorce he never discussed but wore in the set of his shoulders every morning. She didn't know why she started noticing Lucian's habits in the same granular way. She noticed anyway. He drank water, almost always. Occasionally scotch, single malt, never more than 2 fingers, never more than once in a sitting. He read documents rather than using a phone for most communication. He had a habit of turning pens in his left hand when he was listening to someone he didn't entirely believe. A small, precise rotation. Once, twice, 3 times. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. He started talking to her more directly during those weeks. Not personal conversation. Not at first. Questions about the floor, about staff scheduling, about operational inefficiencies she'd noticed. He asked with the focused interest of a man who genuinely wanted the information rather than the performance of consultation, and she found herself answering with more specificity than she'd intended, because the specificity was what he'd actually asked for. One night, late in the 3rd week, she was closing out her section when she found him still at the back booth, alone, the restaurant nearly empty, a glass of scotch in front of him that had barely been touched. She should have left it. She went and sat down. He looked up like he'd expected her, which irritated her, and she let that show slightly. "You're still here," she said. "So are you." "I'm working." "You're done working." He looked at the scotch. "I'm not." She looked at him. Really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to before. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of a long day. The deeper kind. The kind that sleep didn't fix because it wasn't about rest. She knew that kind of tired from the inside. "Do you ever stop?" she said. He turned the glass once. "Stop what?" "Being this." She gestured vaguely at the whole of him. The posture, the vigilance, the invisible weight that seemed to accompany him through every room he entered. "The thing you are." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you?" The question landed differently than she expected. She looked down at the table. "No," she said, "I don't." "Then we understand each other." They sat in the near-empty restaurant for another 10 minutes without speaking, and it was the least uncomfortable silence she'd experienced in 2 years, and she did not know what to do with that, so she did nothing, which was the wrong answer, but it was the only one she had. She was 2 blocks from the restaurant, collar up against the October wind, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Not Gloria's unknown number format. Different. She almost didn't answer. She answered, silence on the other end. Then breathing, controlled, familiar in a way that moved through her stomach like cold water before her brain had fully processed why. "I know," said the voice, "that you're calling yourself Noelle now." Her legs stopped. She was standing in the middle of the sidewalk. People moved around her. "And I know," said Elias Crane, "exactly which restaurant you've been working at." She could not hear her own heartbeat. She couldn't hear anything except his voice and the city around her and the specific familiar quality of the air that accompanied the moment when everything she'd built began to come apart. "I'm not angry," he said, in the tone he always used when he was. "I just want you to understand something." She did not speak. "Whoever you think is protecting you now," Elias said, very quietly, very evenly, "doesn't know what I know about you, doesn't know where you came from, what you did, what you are." A pause. "Come back on your own, and we can forget the last 2 years. Don't—" She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand and her breath coming in shallow pulls that she couldn't control, and the city kept moving around her, indifferent and loud and continuing, the way it always did. She looked at the phone. She thought about calling the number Soren had given her. She thought about going back to the restaurant and finding Lucian still at the back booth and sitting down and saying, "There is something you need to know." She thought about what Elias had said. "Doesn't know what I know about you." She thought about the gym bag under her bed, the cash, the dead phone, the name folded inside it that belonged to a woman who had stood in a doorway 2 years ago with blood on her lip and finally understood that hope was not a feeling, it was a decision you made with your feet. She walked home. 3 locks, checked twice. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. She didn't sleep at all that night. 3 days later, an envelope appeared under the door of her apartment. No return address. No stamp. Hand-delivered, which meant someone had been inside her building, had come up to her floor, had stood outside her door long enough to slide it through. Inside was a single photograph. It was taken from across the street, through the window of Carver's restaurant, during what she recognized as last Tuesday's dinner service. The angle was from street level, a long lens, good quality, no shaking, clear enough to read the timestamp in the corner. In the photograph, she was laughing at something Soren had said. A real laugh. The unguarded kind, the kind she hadn't known she was capable of anymore until she saw proof of it in someone else's photograph. Across the bottom of the image, in handwriting she recognized her own heartbeat. "You look happy." And beneath that, 3 more words. "Fix that. Soon." She sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because her legs gave out, because the floor was cold and solid and real, and she needed something real to press against while she made the decision that was already, underneath the fear and the 2 years of careful construction, already made. She picked up her phone. She pulled up the number Soren had given her. She stared at it for 40 seconds. Then she put the phone in her pocket, went to the closet, pulled down the bag she kept packed at all times from the top shelf, set it on the bed, and began checking its contents with the focused, methodical calm of a woman who had done this before and knew exactly how. She knew how to pack a bag in under 4 minutes. That was not a skill anyone taught you. It was something you learned from repetition, from the specific muscle memory that developed when you had done it enough times under enough pressure that your hands stopped needing instruction from your brain. Passport. The real one. The one she kept separate from the Noel Hart documents. The cash. The burner phone, dead battery swapped for the charged spare she kept in the side pocket. 2 changes of clothes. The small waterproof bag of medication and basics she'd assembled 2 years ago, and refreshed every 3 months like a person maintaining equipment they prayed never to use. She had the bag zipped and her coat on before she fully registered that she was crying. Not sobbing, not dramatic, just the quiet, functional leak of a person whose body had decided to process something that her mind was still refusing to touch directly. She stood in the middle of her bedroom with the bag over her shoulder and tears running down her face in the dark, and she breathed through it, once, twice, until it stopped, because it had to stop. She picked up her phone. She looked at Soren's number. She thought about Elias's voice on the other end of that call, the specific control in it, the evenness, the way he'd always been able to make the most devastating things sound like logistics. That evenness had taken her months to understand, early on. She'd mistaken it for calm. She'd mistaken it for safety. It had taken a locked door and the 3 weeks without her own phone and a broken wrist that he'd explained as a fall on wet pavement for her to understand that the evenness wasn't calm at all. It was the surface of something that had no bottom. She put the phone in her coat pocket without dialing. She went to the front door and stopped. There was an envelope on the floor, not under the door, on the floor, just inside it, which meant it had been there when she'd come home, which meant she'd stepped over it in the dark without noticing, which meant she was already more compromised than she'd thought. She picked it up. Inside was not a photograph this time. It was a key card. Matte black, no logo, no numbers, the same style as the key cards the Obsidian Club used for its private elevator. On the back, in ink, use it, tonight. L. She stood in her hallway for a long time. Then she put the bag down. She went upstairs. The address on the back of the key card wasn't the Obsidian Club. It was a building 12 blocks north that she recognized as one of the properties that appeared in the constellation of Lucien Moretti's legitimate holdings. A narrow, glass-faced tower that appeared, from street level, to be a residential building for the kind of residents who valued discretion over visibility. The lobby had no doorman. The elevator required the key card and accepted it without ceremony. The penthouse floor. The doors opened directly into a space that was the opposite of what she'd expected from a man whose public profile was constructed from fear and rumor. It was spare, clean. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides showing the city in its full, indifferent nighttime sprawl. No excess. Dark furniture, good quality but not ornamental. Bookshelves that had been used, actual use, spines cracked, pages flagged. A kitchen that showed the evidence of someone who cooked, not a showroom. A place where a person actually lived, which was the most disorienting thing about it. Lucien was standing at the window when she came in. He heard her. He didn't turn immediately. She set her bag on the floor near the door. He turned then, and she registered what she saw in his face and let it register fully without flinching from it. He knew. Not the specific contents of what was happening, but the architecture of it. The bag, the coat, the specific stillness of a woman who had been in the process of running and had been interrupted. He read all of it in the space of a second. "Tell me," he said. She did. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. She told him about the phone call. She told him about the envelope. She took the photograph out of her coat pocket and set it on the counter between them without elaboration, and she watched him pick it up and look at the handwriting across the bottom and set it back down with the careful, controlled movement of someone managing a response they had decided not to show. "Elias Crane," she said. "That's his name." Lucien looked at her. "Tell me everything." "That's not everything about now. Everything." His voice was level, not hard, just final in the way of something that had already made up its mind. "How you know him. How long. What happened." She looked at the bag on the floor. She looked at the city outside the window. She thought about how long she'd been carrying it. The specific weight of a story you couldn't tell anyone because telling it meant making it real in front of another person, and making it real in front of another person meant watching their face change and not being able to control what came next. She sat down on the edge of the couch. She told him. All of it. Not in order. It never came in order when it finally came out. It came in the way trauma always came when you finally stopped holding it back, in fragments and pieces that didn't observe chronology. And she let it come that way, without trying to make it narrative, without the editorial control she'd applied to every version of herself she'd constructed over the past 2 years. Elias Crane, 44 years old. A financial investor with the kind of wealth that generated its own weather system, that made institutions bend toward it, and people reorganize their lives around it without fully realizing they were doing so. She'd met him at 24, when she'd been working a corporate event. Not so different from the Obsidian Club in retrospect, except that she hadn't yet learned the particular vocabulary of rooms where powerful men sat and expected everything to orbit them. He'd been charming in the way that people with resources and patience could sustain charm, not flashy, not insistent, just persistently, specifically interested in her in a way she hadn't encountered before, and had mistaken for something that meant she was worth being interested in. The first year had been what she'd thought love was supposed to feel like. The second year was when the parameters had started shifting. Small things. Her friends made him uncomfortable. Her apartment made him uncomfortable. He had a better one. Why didn't she move in? It made sense. It was practical. Her job was unnecessary. Not because he wanted to keep her from working, but because she deserved better, didn't she? She was too good for that. And when the job she was too good for had somehow been replaced by dependence on his calendar, his moods, his interpretation of whether she was behaving in ways that reflected well on what they were together. By then the vocabulary had been established, and she'd learned it so gradually she hadn't noticed it was not a language she'd chosen. The first time he'd hurt her physically, he'd cried afterward. She'd held him. That was the part she still couldn't say out loud without something happening behind her sternum, that she'd held him. She left the third time he put her in the hospital. She ran the first time she could outrun the security he'd installed in the apartment she'd once thought of as his and hers. She'd been running since. When she stopped talking, the room was very quiet. The city outside the window didn't care. It never did. Lucien was sitting in the chair across from her. He'd sat down somewhere during the telling. She wasn't sure exactly when. His hands were folded, forearms resting on his knees. He wasn't looking at her with the expression she'd feared most, the one that translated to pity, which was the thing closest to contempt in her experience. He was looking at her with the controlled, focused steadiness of a man taking a complete inventory of something that mattered. "He's been tracking you for 2 years," he said. "Yes." "How far has he tracked you before this?" "Chicago, Houston, before that Providence." She looked at her hands. "He always found me eventually. I usually had a few months before. How did he find you this time?" Not a question, a direction. She looked up. "I don't know." "Think about it." "I have thought about it. I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 days. Did anyone outside this building know where you were working?" "No, I didn't." She stopped, rewound, thought about it the way he meant, which was methodically, not emotionally. "Patrice," she said slowly, "Patrice Duval. She gave me the referral for the Obsidian Club in the first place. She knew I'd been placed at Carver's because she texted me the first week asking—" She stopped again. Lucien's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Where does Patrice Duval live?" he said. "I don't— Queens, somewhere. I never— How did she know to give you that card for the club?" "She said she knew someone. She never said—" "Did you ever ask?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "No," Noelle said. "I didn't ask." The shape of it was assembling itself in real time, piece by piece, and the assembled shape was the kind of thing that made the floor feel uncertain under your feet. She stood up from the couch. She walked to the window. She pressed one hand flat against the glass. Cold, solid, real, and breathed. "Placed her," she said. "That's one possibility. 2 years ago, she was—" She thought about Patrice. The cigarettes, the bad knees, the studied frankness of a woman who seemed like exactly what she appeared to be. She seemed real. She seemed— "People he uses always do," Lucien said. She pressed her forehead briefly against the glass. The cold of it went straight into her skull. She let it. "He let me run," she said, hearing it as she said it, the shape of it. "He let me get comfortable, and then—" "He narrowed the options," Lucien said, "until the only visible one was the one he wanted you to take." She turned around. She looked at him across the room. "You?" she said. "Coming to you was the option he wanted me to take." Lucien's jaw tightened slightly. Or he adapted when he saw the opportunity. He stood. "Either way, he's trying to destabilize the arrangement. Yours with this." He gestured at the space around them, meaning not the apartment but the whole of what the past weeks had been. "Then me being here makes you a target," she said, "which means I need to go—" "Don't," he said. "Lucien." The name came out before she could stop it. First name. She'd never used it directly before. It landed differently than she'd expected. His face didn't change, but something in his posture did. Barely, fractionally, the way a structure responds to a sound frequency it was built to receive. "Don't tell me to leave," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. She stared at him. "I was going to tell you," he said, "that I need to make some calls, and that you're going to stay here tonight, and that tomorrow we're going to have a different kind of conversation about Elias Crane." He met her eyes. "One where I ask questions you're going to need to answer completely, not partially." She looked at the bag on the floor. And if I don't want to do that, then I'll have someone drive you wherever you want to go, he said. And I'll make sure you have what you need to get there safely, and that's the last thing I'll be able to do. He held her gaze. But if you stay, I need all of it, not what you think I need, everything. She thought about Chicago, about Houston, about the specific texture of starting over in a city where you knew no one and everything you built was constructed on the knowledge that it was temporary, that the ground under it was sand, that the only question was how long before the tide came in again. She thought about how tired she was of sand. Okay, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Okay. She did not pick up the bag. The calls Lucien made were short, quiet, and conducted in the room he used as an office. She could hear the tone but not the content, which she suspected was intentional. She sat in the kitchen with a glass of water she'd poured herself and tried to eat something from the refrigerator but couldn't. She sat with the not eating. She looked at her hands. He came back 20 minutes later. Patrice Duval left her apartment in Queens 6 weeks ago, he said. Forwarding address is a P.O. box in Newark that's been inactive for 4 years. The water glass was very cold in her hand. She set it down. 6 weeks ago. Around the time you started at Carver's. She thought about Patrice. The last text she'd gotten from her had been 3 weeks ago. Brief, cheerful. The kind of text that, in retrospect, had the specific quality of a message designed to not raise flags. He pulled her out once she'd confirmed the placement, Noelle said. Yes. She was his from the beginning. She heard her own voice saying it, and it landed with the particular dull weight of things that were true and could not be made less true by the saying of them. She found me, 2 years ago, in Pittsburgh. She came into the diner where I was working, and she sat at my section, and She stopped. She was so normal. She seemed like someone who'd just had a bad shift. She seemed like, he's good at normal, Lucien said. She looked at him. You know who he is. I know the name. I know the profile. He sat down across from her. I didn't know the connection to you until tonight. How do you know the name? He was quiet for a moment. Because Elias Crane has done business with people in my world. Not directly. 3 and 4 steps removed. But the network exists. He held her gaze. Which means he knows mine exists. The shape of it continued to assemble. He knew, she said slowly. When he tracked me here. When he found out I was at the club, at Carver's. He didn't just find out I'd been placed there. He found out who the placement connected me to. Lucien said nothing, which was its own confirmation. He let me walk into your orbit on purpose, she said, because it gave him leverage, Lucien said, or the appearance of it. She stood up from the table. She wasn't angry yet. She was past the immediate frontier of anger, into the territory beyond it, the cold, clear expanse that she'd learned existed on the other side of the hottest feelings. She walked to the window again. The city, again. Indifferent and continuous. He wants me back, she said. He's always wanted me back. That's not about me as a person. That's about control. About the fact that I left and that I got away, and that every day I'm not back is evidence that something he controlled got outside his control. She pressed her palm flat on the glass. But bringing me back quietly was getting harder. So he evolved the plan. He put me somewhere visible, somewhere connected to someone he could use. He's trying to force a transaction, Lucien said. He comes to me, presents the information he has, gives me the option of either handing you back to him to avoid whatever he's prepared, or watching things become complicated. What kind of complicated? The kind that involves the people in his network and the people in mine, and the space between them becoming significantly less comfortable. He paused. He thinks that's a threat I can't absorb. She turned from the window. Can you? He looked at her steadily. Yes. Lucien. She said his name again, deliberately this time. Don't tell me what you think I need to hear. I'm not, he said. I'm telling you what's true. He stood. He moved to the kitchen, poured 2 fingers of scotch, set the glass on the counter without drinking from it. Elias Crane has connections and resources. He does not have infrastructure. There's a difference. Infrastructure, she repeated. The kind of relationships that hold when pressure is applied. The kind of loyalty that doesn't renegotiate when someone makes a better offer. He turned to look at her. His people are bought. Mine are. Something else. She looked at him. She thought about the 2 years. The running, the reinventions, the specific exhaustion of building and losing and rebuilding, and the specific loneliness of doing all of it alone because there was no one you could trust with the full picture. He's going to contact you, she said, directly, if he hasn't already. Lucian reached into his jacket pocket and set his phone on the counter between them, screen up. There was a message on it. She could read it from where she stood. Short, no name at the top. The number was blocked. 4 lines. I think we have a mutual interest in reaching an arrangement. The woman you've been keeping company with belongs to a complicated history. I have documentation you'd find instructive. I'd prefer to resolve this without involving parties who would find the situation inconvenient for everyone. Reach out when you're ready to be reasonable. She read it twice. Then she looked at Lucian. When did that come in? An hour before I sent you the key card. She processed that. She processed what it meant that he'd read that message, and his next action had been to get her off the street and into a building he controlled. She processed what it meant that he hadn't, in the hour between the message and her arrival, done the thing that would have been logical from a purely transactional perspective, the thing that would have protected his position and eliminated the complication with the least friction. He had not sent her away. She didn't say anything for a moment. The documentation he's referring to, she said finally. Yes. It exists. What he has or what he thinks he has. Both. She sat back down at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface. Before I left, there was a period when I had less access to myself than I thought I did. He made decisions during that time about finances, about certain transactions, under my name. She looked at her hands. I didn't know until later, and by then I was trying to get out, and the priority was the getting out, not the, what kind of transactions? The kind that on paper looked like someone who knew what they were doing made them deliberately. She met his eyes. I didn't know what they were. I didn't authorize them. But they have my name on them, and his lawyers have had 2 years to make them look like whatever he needs them to look like. Lucienne was very still. He's been constructing a version of me, she said, hearing the flatness in her own voice and not able to change it. For 2 years, while I was running, building a version that he can produce whenever he needs to make me look like someone who went willingly, participated willingly, who is not a victim of anything but my own decisions. The silence in the room was complete. Then Lucian said very quietly, How much does he have? Enough, she said. If it was ever put in front of a judge who didn't know how to look at it or who had reason to look at it a specific way, she stopped. He knows people in courthouses, Lucienne. That's not a metaphor. She watched him take that in. She watched the controlled, precise machinery of his thinking engage with it, the slight shift in his eyes that was the only visible sign that he was revising something. He played a long game, Lucian said. He always does. He let you run because the running was useful to him. Every city I went to, every job, every name, he had someone documenting it, building the record of a woman who runs, who hides, who operates under false identities. By the time he produces all of it together, it doesn't look like a man hunting a woman he abused. It looks like a woman with something to hide making choices that pattern like guilt. Lucian put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up at her. He's going to move soon, he said. The message tonight was a courtesy, his version of one. He gave me the option to be reasonable because he wanted to see if I was the kind of man who would be. He looked at her directly. He doesn't think I'll choose to absorb this. Will you? She asked. He held her gaze. I already have. She opened her mouth. But I need you to understand something, he said. If we do this, if we stay in this room and we make this decision together, it stops being about running. It stops being about the next city and the next name. He was very close to what might be called intensity, though it was so controlled that it read as something closer to gravity. What comes next requires you to stop disappearing and start being found. Not by him. On your terms. With support behind you. He paused. Can you do that? She thought about the gym bag, the years of it, the extraordinary, crushing discipline of being no one. She thought about the photograph, her own laughing face, captured through a restaurant window by a man who'd spent 2 years building a legal architecture to trap her inside a version of herself she'd never been. She thought about what it had cost her to become invisible, and what it was going to cost her to become visible again, and whether she had anything left to spend. She looked at Lucien Moretti across the kitchen of his penthouse apartment at 1 a.m, and she said, "What do you need from me?" He reached into his jacket again. This time he set 3 things on the counter: a small velvet box, a legal pad, and a pen. "The box first," he said. She reached for it. Inside were 3 keys on a plain steel ring, brass worn at the edges, the kind of keys that opened things that mattered rather than things that were meant to impress. She looked up at him. "The first one is this building," he said. "You don't need my permission to be here or to leave. That ends tonight." He looked at the keys, not at her, and his voice was level in the way of something that was costing him more than it showed. "The second one is a property in Connecticut, safe house. No one outside of 2 people knows it exists." He paused. "The third one belongs to a safe deposit box. It contains documentation, the kind that outweighs what he has. Not about you, about the transactions, the real record of what was done in your name and who made the decisions." He finally looked at her. "I had people looking before you told me tonight. I had people looking the day after you sat down in that booth and told me it wasn't meaningful." She stared at him. "It was meaningful," he said simply. "To me." She looked at the keys in her hand. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at the pen. "The pad," he said, "is for the full account. Everything you told me tonight, and everything you haven't yet, names, dates, locations, we're going to build a record that belongs to you, in your words, with documentation to support each piece of it." He sat down across from her at the table. "And then we're going to make sure that when Elias Crane produces his version, there's already another version in existence that—" His phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at it. Something changed in his face. Not much. Not much was needed when you'd learned to read him. She looked at the phone. The screen was lit with a photograph, sent to the same blocked number that had sent the message earlier. The photograph was of the front entrance of the building they were sitting in, taken from street level. Timestamp, 11 minutes ago. At the bottom of the photograph, 1 line of text. "I see she made her choice, so have I. Let's talk about what that cost you both." The room was very quiet. Noelle set the keys down on the table. She picked up the pen. She looked at Lucien and said with the specific, exhausted steadiness of a woman who had finished running and understood completely what that meant, "Tell me where to start." And outside the window, the city continued its indifferent sprawl, enormous and uncaring, while somewhere in it a man with resources and patience and 2 years of constructed evidence began making phone calls, unaware that the woman he'd spent 2 years reducing to a fugitive had finally stopped moving, had finally put her back against something solid, and had finally, for the first time in longer than she could remember, decided to— She wrote for 3 hours. Not continuously. There were stops, long ones, where she had to put the pen down and breathe through something before she could continue, where the act of making it sequential and documented ran up against the part of her brain that had spent 2 years refusing to make it sequential and documented because making it that way meant owning it completely, meant no longer being able to keep it at the peripheral distance of something she was surviving rather than something that had happened to her body and her life with her full conscious witness. Lucien sat across from her for the first hour. He didn't prompt her, didn't direct the account, didn't react visibly to what she wrote. He was just there, which was more than she'd had before, which was the specific thing she hadn't known how much she'd needed until it was present, and she felt the difference it made to her handwriting. Steadier than she expected, the letters cleaner than they had any right to be. Around 2 a.m, he went to the kitchen and made coffee without asking if she wanted any, and set a cup beside the legal pad without breaking her concentration, and she drank it without looking up. And somewhere in the middle of the second hour, the account became less fragmentary and more sequential, and she understood that was because she was less afraid of the sequence than she'd been when she'd started. She filled 9 pages, dates, locations, names of medical personnel at 3 separate hospitals, two of whom had been persuaded to document the injuries as accidental. Account numbers with her name on transactions she'd never authorized, cross-referenced with dates she could place herself elsewhere because she had the receipts from the hotels she'd stayed in, the diners she'd eaten at, the bus tickets she'd bought in cash that she'd kept in the bottom of the gym bag because some part of her had known, even then, that the keeping of receipts was the keeping of proof. When she finished, she set the pen down and looked at what she'd produced and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite exhaustion, but the specific depleted clarity of a thing completed. Lucien took the pages. He read them at the table in the same focused silence with which he read everything, and she watched his face for the micro-expressions that were the only visible register of what he was processing. Once, on the fourth page, his jaw tightened and released in under a second. Twice, something behind his eyes went briefly colder than his resting temperature, which was already not warm. He said nothing until he'd read all 9 pages, and then he set them face down on the table and was quiet for a moment. 2 of the names in here, he said, the financial contacts he used for the account setup. I know where they are. She looked at him. How? Because they work in a space that overlaps with mine. He met her eyes. Which means they understand the specific cost of being exposed in both directions simultaneously. She understood what he meant. She understood it was not a threat he was describing so much as a structural reality, that the men Elias had used to build his paper architecture had done so assuming their participation would remain invisible, which it had, right up until it hadn't. Can you get to them before he does? She said. Before he realizes they're a vulnerability, Lucien said. Yes. How long? He looked at his watch. 6 hours. Maybe 5. She looked at the window. The city outside was doing what cities did between 3 and 4 in the morning, reduced to its skeleton, the noise stripped back to its component sounds, the occasional cab, the irregular percussion of infrastructure maintaining itself. He won't wait 6 hours, she said. No, Lucien agreed. He won't. He picked up his phone and made the first call. She listened to the calls without pretending she wasn't listening. There were 4 of them, each short, each conducted in the specific register of a man communicating with people who understood that tone meant action rather than discussion. She caught names, not the names of people she recognized, but the quality of how they were addressed, which told her things about the relationships that the names alone wouldn't have. After the 4th call, he set the phone down and looked at her with an expression she'd not seen from him before. Something careful. Something that was measuring what he was about to say against her capacity to receive it. Elias Crane made a call 40 minutes ago, he said, to a contact in the DA's office. She went completely still. He's not filing anything yet. He's positioning, establishing that the documentation exists and that it may need to be examined in the context of a person operating under a false identity. He held her gaze. He's building the frame before he puts anything in it. He's going to have me arrested, she said. He's going to try to create the conditions under which that's possible, Lucien said, so that when he comes to you or to me, the alternative to complying is a legal process that he's already primed. She stood up. She needed to be standing. How did you know he made that call? Because I have a contact in the same office. She looked at him. I told you, he said simply. Infrastructure. She pressed her hand against her sternum, where something was happening that wasn't quite pain but occupied the same general region. She breathed through it. He's going to move in the morning, she said. Publicly, in a way that makes it harder for you to absorb without cost. Yes. Which means tonight is the window. Yes? She turned and looked at him fully. What are you going to do? He stood. He put on his jacket, which had been draped over the chair beside him, and he did it with the specific economy of movement of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it rather than contemplating it. I'm going to go have a conversation, he said, with the 2 financial contacts first. Then with Marco, who has a relationship with someone in Crane's security detail who has been having second thoughts about that relationship for reasons that predate this situation. He straightened his jacket. And then I'm going to make sure that by the time morning arrives, the structure Crane has been building for 2 years has enough fractures in it that the first real pressure collapses it. She stared at him. Tonight. Tonight. Lucien, if he's already moved toward the DA's office, he's salted the ground, Lucien said. He hasn't planted anything yet. There's still a window, small, but it's there. He looked at her. I need you to stay here, not because I'm containing you, because this building is the most defensible position available, and I need to know where you are. She thought about arguing. She looked at his face and recognized the thing she was seeing in it wasn't control. Wasn't the architecture of someone organizing her into a position of compliance. It was the specific expression of a man who was afraid of something and was managing the fear with logistics rather than words. Okay, she said. He nodded once. He picked up the legal pad and folded the pages into his jacket. He moved toward the elevator. Lucien. He stopped. She crossed the room to him. She stood close enough that she had to look up slightly, and she said, Come back. Something moved across his face. Not the assessment, not the controlled steadiness, something raw and less managed. That's the plan, he said. The elevator closed. She stood in the middle of the penthouse and listened to it descend. Then she went to the window and watched the street below until a black car pulled out from the building's underground entrance and moved north and disappeared into the skeleton city. She lasted 40 minutes before she stopped trying to wait passively. The legal pad was gone, but the pen was still on the table, and her memory of those 9 pages was complete, and she had the receipts in her bag, the physical ones, the ones she'd kept for 2 years for reasons she'd never fully articulated to herself, but which now made the specific, vindicating sense of an instinct proven right. She organized them on the kitchen table in chronological order, 17 receipts from hotels and bus stations and roadside diners spanning 26 months, each one a small, time-stamped alibi for the woman who had not been in those cities making those transactions and had instead been somewhere else, surviving. She photographed each one with her phone and emailed the photographs to an address Lucien had written on a piece of paper before leaving. Not his own, but a lawyer's, a name she didn't recognize, but which he'd said with the brevity of complete confidence. She was doing the last photograph when her phone rang. Not the lawyer's email. Her phone. The burner she'd had for 6 months, whose number she'd given to no one except the scheduling system at the Obsidian Club. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Different unknown from the previous calls. A New Jersey area code. She answered. You're smarter than I remembered. Elias. Not the same voice as the phone call 3 days ago. That had been controlled, the evenness she remembered. This was something else. Still controlled, but with a different quality underneath it. The kind of control that was being maintained against resistance rather than from a position of ease. She said nothing. Going to him, Elias continued. That was adaptive. I'll give you credit for that. I didn't anticipate you'd move that fast. A pause. But you've put him in a position he's going to find very uncomfortable very soon. And when men like that get uncomfortable, they make practical decisions. You of all people should understand what it means to be someone's practical decision. She kept her breathing even. What do you want, Elias? Same thing I've always wanted. The control slipped, fractionally, just for a syllable. For you to stop running. For this to be over. It is over, she said, just not the way you planned it. He can't protect you from what's already been filed. Nothing's been filed, she said. You're building a frame. You told your contact in the DA's office that documentation exists. You haven't produced it yet because once you produce it, you lose the leverage. It only works as long as it's a threat. She paused, hearing her own voice saying things she hadn't known she understood until this moment. You need me scared. You need me to make a decision out of fear before anyone has a chance to look closely at what you've actually built. Another pause. I'm not scared anymore. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. You will be, he said. He hung up. She set the phone down on the table. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them the way she'd looked at them in the elevator of the Obsidian Club 6 months ago, the night she'd first gone upstairs, and she applied the same assessment, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the specific biochemistry of a body that had just done something it hadn't been certain it was capable of, which was to tell the truth to the man who had spent years making her believe the truth was not something she was entitled to. She was still looking at her hands when the first sound reached her. Not the elevator. The stairwell. A door, very far below, opening with the specific weight of something that was trying not to make a sound, and was therefore making slightly more sound than a door opened without that concern. She wasn't certain she'd heard it. The city outside covered a lot, but she'd spent 2 years sleeping at a frequency where she caught things other people slept through. She stood up slowly. She moved to the kitchen and stood with her back against the counter, angled toward the elevator and the only other door in the space. The service entrance, she'd noted it when she arrived. A heavy door near the far end of the hall that she'd registered because she registered every secondary exit in every room she entered. The building had 12 floors. The penthouse elevator required the key card. The stairwell had a different access system, building standard, not Lucien's custom security. And she didn't know what that meant about who could get into it. She picked up her phone. She called the number Lucien had left. It rang 4 times. Voicemail. She tried again. 4 rings. Voicemail. She put the phone in her pocket and moved to the service door and pressed her ear against it and heard nothing, which was not the same as nothing being there. She went back to the main room. She found the kitchen knife block by the stove. Serious knives, a person who actually cooked, and she selected the one that felt like a decision rather than a gesture and held it at her side and stood in the middle of the room. She thought about what Elias had said. You will be. She thought about the timing of that call, made after she'd spoken to Lucien, after Lucien had left, which meant the service door opened. Not violently, not dramatically. It simply opened with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had a key or had acquired the functional equivalent of one. And the man who came through it was not Elias. He was large, efficient in the way of someone professionally so, and his eyes went to her immediately with the focused non-expression of a person executing a task rather than making a choice. Behind him, another man, shorter, standing in the doorway. She tightened her grip on the knife. The large man looked at it. His expression didn't change. "Ms. Hart," he said, "Mr. Crane would like you to come with us." She said nothing. He'd prefer this to be uncomplicated. Then he should have picked a different business, she said. He took a step forward. She moved backward and to the right, keeping the counter between them and her back away from anything solid, keeping the geometry of the room in her head the way she'd been keeping it since she arrived. The elevator was 10 feet behind her. The keycard was in her coat pocket, which was draped over the couch arm. Too far. The man would cover that distance before she reached it. The second man was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved toward her. He was watching the first with the attention of someone waiting for a cue. She calculated angles. She calculated badly, probably, because her blood was loud in her ears and the room felt both very large and very small simultaneously. But she calculated anyway because the alternative was to stop calculating and she had not come this far to stop. The large man reached across the counter. She moved first. Not toward him. Away and left. Toward the window side of the room, forcing him to redirect, buying 3 seconds, and using them to put the full width of the kitchen island between them. She was not going to win a physical confrontation. She was not trying to. She was trying to be inconvenient enough, loud enough, present enough as a problem that resolution required time. And time in this specific situation was the only resource she had to spend. She knocked the coffee cups off the counter on her way past. The sound was enormous in the quiet of the penthouse. She followed it with the knife block itself, sending it clattering across the floor between her and the large man, the knives scattering with a noise that ricocheted off every hard surface in the room. "Stop," he said sharply. "No," she said. She reached the front door, the main one, the elevator side, and got her hand on the handle and pulled, and it was locked from the inside with a secondary deadbolt she hadn't noticed when she'd come in, and the half-second it took her to find and disengage it was the half-second the large man needed to cross the room. His hand closed on her arm. Not the wrist. The upper arm, the grip of someone trained to control movement rather than cause pain, which was its own kind of information. He'd been told to bring her intact and uninjured, which meant Elias still needed something from her that required her to be functional. She drove her elbow back, connected with something that produced a sharp exhalation from behind her. The grip loosened fractionally. She twisted left, used the loosening, got her arm free, and the forward momentum took her into the door rather than away from it, and her cheekbone met the edge of the door frame with a crack, that she felt all the way through her skull. She did not go down. She did not go down because going down was the end of the options, and she still had options, and so she stayed upright with white light eating the edges of her vision and her hand still on the door handle, and she got the deadbolt open and the door open, and she was in the hallway outside. The elevator. 15 feet. She ran. The large man was in the doorway behind her. She heard him, but she didn't look back because looking back cost the fraction of a second she didn't have, and she reached the elevator and hit the call button and heard the mechanism engage, and she pressed her back against the wall beside the doors because the hallway was narrow and the angle mattered. He came out of the doorway. He stopped when he saw her position. He was reassessing. The second man appeared behind him in the doorway. The elevator arrived. She was inside it before the doors finished opening. She hit the lobby button. She hit the door close button with the specific, useless repetition of someone who understood that button didn't actually work, but was physically incapable of not pressing it. The large man reached the elevator doors as they closed. She saw his face through the narrowing gap. Not angry, not panicked, just recalibrating. And that expression, that professional, unemotional recalibration, was somehow more frightening than anger would have been, because anger made mistakes, and that face did not look like a face that made mistakes. The elevator descended. She pressed her back against the wall of the elevator cab and put her hand to her cheekbone and felt the heat of it, the beginning of swelling that was going to be significant. Her vision was mostly clear. She breathed. She counted floors. 12, 11, 10. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Lucian's number. Building compromised. Do not use lobby. Service exit. Sub-basement, east side. She stared at it. She hit the sub-basement button. The elevator shifted its direction without hesitation. She stood in the descending elevator with her hand against her face and her pulse in her teeth, and she thought about the calls she'd made that Elias hadn't anticipated, and whether there were any remaining moves she could make that he also hadn't anticipated, and whether the architecture she and Lucien had spent a night building on 9 pages of a legal pad was enough to stand against 2 years of deliberate construction. The elevator stopped. Sub-basement. Concrete walls. The specific cold of a below-ground space that never fully warmed. Fluorescent lighting, half of it flickering. She could see the service corridor stretching east, a long straight run with 3 doors on the right side and a loading bay door at the far end, closed, a stripe of orange safety paint across the bottom of it. She ran. Behind her, she heard the elevator engage again, going up, being called back up. And then a second sound. The stairwell door on the far side of the sub-basement, a heavy clang of metal against the catch, someone coming down fast. She ran harder. The loading bay door had a push-bar release. She hit it with both palms at full speed and the door opened and the cold air of a service alley hit her face, the specific cold of a New York pre-dawn, 4:30 in the morning, November. The alley narrow and dark and smelling of exhaust and standing water. A car was idling at the far end of the alley. Black. Engine running. She stopped. The driver's door opened. Not Lucien, a man she didn't recognize. Young, compact, with the same professional stillness she'd learned to associate with the people in Lucien's orbit who served specific functions. Marco sent me, he said. Get in. Boop. She stood in the alley for exactly 1 second, which was the time it took her to calculate that she had no better option, and that the specific quality of the stillness in this man was not the same as the quality she'd seen in the large man upstairs. She got in. The car moved before the door was fully closed. She looked through the back window as they exited the alley onto the street. The loading bay door was still open. No one had come through it yet. Where are we going? She said. To Mr. Moretti, the driver said. Where is he? Dealing with a situation. She looked at her phone. She called Lucien's number. This time he answered on the second ring. You're in the car. His voice was tight in a way she'd never heard before. Yes, what happened? Crane moved faster than I expected. He had someone inside the building. Not security, maintenance staff. Placed a week ago. A pause with sounds in the background she couldn't immediately identify. Are you hurt? She touched her cheekbone. No, she said, in the specific way of someone who had decided that the honest answer to that question was not useful right now. A pause. Don't lie to me. I'm functional, she said. That's the operative question. Another pause. Then, we have the financial contacts, both of them. They've been persuaded that cooperation with us is significantly preferable to the alternative. The background sounds resolved into what she recognized as a vehicle interior, engine noise, city sounds through glass. Crane's legal threat just lost 2 of its 3 structural supports. What's the third? She said. His contact in the DA's office, Lucian said, who is currently receiving documentation from a source with considerably more institutional credibility than anything Crane can produce. A pause. That conversation is happening right now. She leaned her head back against the seat. Outside the window, the city was beginning its early morning transition, the skeleton hour giving way to the first faint suggestion of color. He sent people to the penthouse, she said. I know. I'm sorry. I underestimated the timeline. She had never heard him say that before. I'm sorry. It came out without ceremony, without the qualification she'd have expected, just the words in the tone of someone who meant them and offered them as fact rather than performance. Where are we going? She asked again. A property in Brooklyn, one he doesn't know about. A pause. One more thing. Noelle. She heard her name, her chosen name, the one she'd built from a street sign and a grandmother's, in his voice, and the way he said it had a quality she hadn't heard before, a specific gravity. He has your original identity documents, Lucian said. The name you were born with. He filed them tonight as part of the positioning with the DA, which means the name Noelle Hart is burned, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. Noelle Hart, 6 months. Longer than some of the others, shorter than she'd hoped. Okay, she said. Okay? His voice was careful. It's just a name, she said. I've had others. She looked out the window at the lightning city. I'll need a new one. A pause. Then quietly. We'll handle that. The we landed differently than she expected. She didn't say anything for a moment, and he didn't press, and the car moved through the pre-dawn streets of a city that was finally, slowly, beginning to wake. Lucien, she said. Yes. He's going to come for this himself. She was certain of it in the specific way of someone who had spent years learning the internal logic of a person who believed that personal appearance was the only form of resolution that mattered. When the legal architecture starts failing, when the contacts go quiet, when the documentation collapses, she pressed her hand against the cold window glass. He's going to stop delegating. The silence on the other end of the phone had a particular quality. I know, Lucian said. You need to be ready for that. I am. He's not like the men you usually deal with, she said. He doesn't respond to the same, Noelle. His voice was steady and low and certain in the way of solid things. I've been ready for him since the night you sat down across from me in that booth. A pause. He just didn't know that. The car turned off the bridge approach and into Brooklyn, the streets changing character immediately, the specific different density of a different borough at an hour when it was mostly quiet. The driver had not spoken since the alley. He navigated without GPS from memory through streets that got progressively less lit and more industrial, until he stopped in front of a building that was unremarkable from the outside. Converted warehouse, no signage, windows dark, the kind of building that could be anything or nothing. There was a light on inside. She could see it through the gap under a heavy door. She got out of the car. The driver stayed in the vehicle without explanation. She stood in front of the heavy door. Her cheekbone was throbbing now in earnest, the swelling arriving with the specific delayed punctuality of injuries that were polite enough to wait until the immediate crisis was addressed before presenting their invoice. She put her hand against it once, assessed, let it be. She pushed the door open. The interior was a single large space, cleared of whatever it had previously contained, lit by 4 industrial lights in the ceiling. At the far end, a folding table with a laptop and 3 phones. 2 of Lucien's men she recognized by silhouette standing at the left wall. And Lucien. He was on a call. He registered her entrance without turning. She saw it in the slight shift of his posture. but completed the call before he turned, which took another 40 seconds, and in those 40 seconds she stood in the middle of the warehouse and breathed the cold, dusty air and let her heartbeat do what it was going to do and waited. He turned. He saw her face immediately, the cheekbone, the swelling that was now visible in the overhead light. His expression moved through something too fast to name and settled into the controlled, focused stillness, but different, denser. He crossed the space between them. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face for a moment without touching, which she understood was a question, and she nodded slightly, which was the answer. He reached up and put his fingers carefully along her jaw, tilting her face toward the light to look at the damage, and she let him, which was itself something she noted. The letting. "Not broken," he said. "No," she agreed. He lowered his hand. He looked at her directly with those dark, assessing eyes, and what she saw in them was the same thing she'd heard in his voice on the phone. Not the controlled steadiness this time, but something underneath it, something that had been there since the first night and had been accumulating the way water accumulated behind a barrier that was well-built, but not invulnerable. "I found him," Lucian said. She went still. "Crane, I know where he is right now." He held her gaze. "He came into the city himself 2 hours ago. He's at a property in Midtown, a corporate apartment not registered to his name. He came personally. She had said it to him on the phone 20 minutes ago. He's going to come for this himself. And she had been right, and being right about it didn't feel like anything she'd expected. He panicked, she said. He moved up the timeline, Lucian said, which means his next move is fast and direct rather than constructed. He's going to reach out to you, not me, you, with something that requires an immediate response, something designed to bypass the time needed to think. She thought about the phone call in the penthouse, the control that had been maintained against resistance. She thought about what lived underneath that control when it came off. He's going to threaten someone I care about, she said. Lucienne was quiet. I don't have... She stopped. Thought. My sister. I haven't spoken to her in 2 years. I cut contact because I was afraid he'd use her. She looked at Lucienne. He knows about her. He's always known. He never used it before because he didn't need to. She felt the cold of it move through her. But if he's panicking... Lucienne turned and said something sharp to the man at the left wall, who picked up one of the phones immediately. She stood in the middle of the warehouse with the cold of a November Brooklyn pre-dawn around her, and the throbbing in her cheekbone and 9 pages of truth folded inside Lucien's jacket, and the understanding arriving with the specific, terrible clarity of something that had been true all along and was only now fully visible. This was not going to resolve through legal architecture or institutional leverage or the careful dismantling of someone else's carefully built structure. The structure was failing, and Elias knew it was failing, and a man who had spent 2 years building something and felt it coming apart did not respond with careful adjustment. He responded with the specific, focused desperation of someone who had one card left and knew it and was going to play it regardless of the cost, because losing was not something he was capable of accepting, and the card he had left was her sister's safety, and she was the only person in this room who understood exactly how he thought about that card and what he was prepared to do with it, which meant she was the only person who could be in the room when he played it. She looked at Lucienne. I need a phone, she said. Not mine. A clean one. He reached into his pocket and held one out. And I need you to tell me, she said, that whatever happens in the next 2 hours, you trust me to make decisions in that conversation that you won't be able to anticipate in advance. He looked at her for a long moment. I need you to say it, she said. Out loud. I trust you, he said, without hesitation, without qualification. She took the phone. She looked at it in her hand. Outside the warehouse, the city was building toward dawn, the first gray light beginning at the edges of the sky, the sound of the early infrastructure starting up, the specific sound of a city deciding to begin again. Somewhere in Midtown, in a corporate apartment registered under a name that wasn't his, Elias Crane was looking at a phone and making the calculation of what he had left and what it was going to cost to use it. She dialed her sister's number from memory. It rang once, twice, and then a voice answered that was not her sister's voice, and the voice said, I was wondering when you'd call. And the voice was Elias. And the warehouse was very, I was wondering when you'd call. She did not react. That was the first decision, made in the half-second between hearing the voice and the next breath. Do not react. Do not give him the sound of your fear, because fear was the only currency he'd ever accepted from her, and she was done paying in it. The warehouse was very quiet around her. She could feel Lucien 2 feet to her left without looking at him. She could feel the specific quality of his stillness, the way he'd gone absolutely motionless the moment she'd changed, the way he was reading her face and the phone simultaneously and saying nothing because he'd said he trusted her and he was making that real in the only way that mattered, which was by not taking the phone from her hand. Where is she? She said. She's fine. Elias's voice had the evenness back. The crisis management evenness. It meant he thought he was winning. She's comfortable. She's confused, which is understandable, but she's not hurt. That's contingent, obviously. On what? On the next hour of your choices. A pause. You know what I want. She looked at the far wall of the warehouse. Concrete block, old paint, a crack running diagonally from the upper left corner. She focused on it. You want me to come to you, she said. I want this to be over, he said. I want things to go back to something manageable. What's happened in the last 12 hours has been a pause, the sound of him choosing a word carefully, escalatory in ways that don't benefit anyone. You took my sister. I'm keeping your sister safe while we resolve a situation, he said. There's a distinction. The specific vocabulary of it, the reframing, the passive construction, the way the violence of what he'd done was being reshelved as crisis management. She recognized it so completely, so physically, that she felt it in her jaw, a tightening. Where? She said again. Come alone, he said. Leave Moretti out of it. This is between you and me. It's always been between you and me, and the sooner we acknowledge that, the sooner your sister goes home. She looked at Lucien. He was watching her with complete, focused attention. He'd heard enough. The warehouse was quiet enough, and Elias's voice was loud enough. She watched Lucien's face process what he was hearing, and she watched him stay still. Send me proof she's okay, she said into the phone. A pause. Then her phone, her actual phone, in her coat pocket, buzzed with a photograph. She pulled it out with her free hand. Her sister Claire, 31 years old, dark hair, darker than Noelle's, a face that was built from the same bones but assembled differently, the way siblings shared architecture and diverged in the details. She was sitting in what looked like a hotel room, wrists zip-tied to the arm of a chair, expression tight with the controlled fear of a woman who had decided not to let herself panic, because panicking felt like conceding something. She looked like their mother when she was angry. Something moved through the center of Noelle's chest. She folded it down. I see her, she said. The address, Elias said, and gave it. Midtown. The corporate apartment Lucien had already identified, which meant he was there, which meant Claire was there, which meant every relevant piece of this was in one location. She'd expected him to scatter them. He hadn't. He was consolidating. He thought the consolidation was strength. She looked at it from the outside and recognized it as what it was, the behavior of a man who had lost the distributed infrastructure and was pulling everything toward himself because the center was all he had left. 1 hour, he said. Alone. He hung up. She lowered the phone. She looked at Lucien and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence had a particular quality, the quality of two people who were about to disagree about something that mattered. No, he said. You said you trusted me. I trust you. I don't trust him. He took a step toward her. He has no intention of releasing your sister. He has no intention of letting either of you leave that building. He's been building toward this for 2 years, and what he's built toward is not a negotiation. I know that, she said. He stopped. I know that, she said again. I know him better than anyone in this room. I know what he wants, and I know what he's capable of, and I know that walking into that apartment is not the same as walking into safety. She held his gaze. I'm not going there to negotiate. I'm going there to keep him focused on me while you take the building." The warehouse was very quiet. "Tell me what you need," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him work through it. Not the logistics, those were already assembling behind his eyes with the speed of someone who did this, who had always done this, who had built a life around the management of impossible situations. He was working through something else. The specific cost of what she was proposing. The specific cost to him personally, which was a kind he was not accustomed to calculating. 40 minutes, he said finally. "I need 40 minutes to position people." He gave me an hour. "I need 30 of those to get you wired and briefed on the layout." He paused. "And I need you to understand that if anything changes, if the situation shifts in any way I haven't accounted for, you get out of the room, any way you can. You don't wait for me." "Lucien." "Say it back." She looked at him. "If anything changes, I get out." He held her gaze for another second. Then he turned and began making calls. 32 minutes later, she was in the back of a different car, moving north toward Midtown, wearing a gray wool coat over the same clothes she'd been in since the previous evening, her cheekbones swollen and beginning to bruise in the specific yellow-purple palette of impact injuries, a wire taped below her left collarbone that she could feel as a small, constant pressure against her skin. The earpiece was barely visible. She'd checked in the car mirror. She looked at the city going by. Daylight now, proper daylight, 6:40 in the morning, the city in full November morning operation. Cabs, delivery trucks, people moving with the particular purposeful density of a city's working hours. All of it indifferent, all of it continuing. She thought about Claire, about the last time she'd seen her, a gas station in Pennsylvania 2 years ago, 40 minutes after she'd finally gotten out. Claire had driven 3 hours on a phone call that had lasted less than a minute. Just, "I need you. I can't explain. I need someone to see me leave." She'd sat in the passenger seat of Claire's car in a gas station parking lot in the November cold, and Claire had not asked a single question, had just reached over and held her hand, and she'd cried in a way she hadn't cried since, the complete, ungoverned kind. Then she'd told Claire to go home and forget the gas station, and Claire had looked at her for a long time and said, "You're going to be okay," not as a comfort, as a judgment delivered by someone who knew her from the inside. She hadn't spoken to her since, because speaking meant a trail, because a trail meant what had now happened anyway. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. 4 minutes out, the driver said. She took her hand from the glass. She straightened in the seat. She went through it one more time. The layout Lucien's man had sketched for her: 9th floor, corner unit, 2 points of entry, the position of the building's secondary stairwell, the specific sequence of what she needed to do to keep Elias in the main room and away from Claire for as long as it took the team in the stairwell to cover 9 floors. She had done harder things. She had done harder things with less. The car stopped a block from the building. "I'll be listening," Lucien said in her ear. His voice through the earpiece was clear and close and steady. The whole time. She got out of the car. She walked the block. The building's lobby was corporate bland and nearly empty at this hour. A security desk with a guard who registered her arrival with professional boredom and called up to the 9th floor without ceremony. Brief wait. A nod. The elevator. She rode it up. 9th floor. The hallway was carpeted in the aggressive pattern of corporate hospitality spaces designed to muffle sound. 3 doors visible from the elevator, corner unit on the left. She knocked. The door opened immediately. Not Elias. A man she didn't recognize, broad in the way of function rather than aesthetics, who looked at her face with the professional non-expression she'd now seen enough times to read as the specific blankness of someone who had outsourced their ethical responses. He stepped back. She went in. The apartment was large as corporate apartments went. Living area, kitchen visible to the right. 2 doors down a short hallway that she marked without appearing to mark. Elias was standing at the window. The same window position she'd seen in Lucien's penthouse, which meant something about the kind of men who stood at windows, the specific relationship between height and the illusion of control. He turned when she came in. She had not seen him in 2 years. He looked the same. This was the thing about him she'd almost forgotten. He looked completely, aggressively ordinary. 44 years old, medium height, The kind of appearance that didn't accumulate into anything that matched the internal architecture. If you passed him in a lobby, you wouldn't look twice. She had learned that ordinariness was the most dangerous thing about him, more dangerous than the money and the contacts and the 2-year campaign, because it was what made the exposure of what he was so difficult. He didn't look like what he was. He never had. "You look tired," he said. "Yes," she said. He gestured toward the sitting area. "Sit down." "Where is she?" "Sit down first." She looked at him. She sat down. Not because he'd told her to, because she needed the angle. Sitting, she could see both hallway doors and the window and the front door behind her without turning her head. He sat across from her. He looked at her with the specific, focused attention she remembered from the beginning, from the first year, before she'd understood what lived behind it. "You've been busy," he said. She said nothing. "Moretti," he said. "That was unexpected. I'll admit that. I expected you to run again. I had coverage on the bus terminals and the train stations." He tilted his head slightly. "You stayed, and you went toward rather than away. That was new." "People change," she said. "They don't, usually." He looked at her with something that was almost clinical. "What changed?" She thought about the word. The single accidental word in a restaurant, and the way a man she'd barely known had gone absolutely still. "I got tired," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not the control, but something beneath it. Something that was either genuine or a performance of genuine. And she'd spent enough time with him that she still wasn't always certain which it was. "I can fix that," he said. "The tired. That's what I've been trying to tell you. For 2 years. What you've been doing, the running, the names, the starting over, that's what's exhausting you. Come back and—" "Where is Claire?" His jaw tightened, fractionally. "She's fine. I want to see her. After we finish talking. I want to see her now," she said, "or this conversation is already over." The man near the door shifted his weight. She saw it in her peripheral vision and did not look at him. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and went to the closer of the 2 hallway doors and opened it and said something quietly. A moment later, Claire appeared in the doorway. Her wrists were no longer zip-tied. She was walking under her own power. Her eyes found Noelle's immediately. And what moved across her face was not the relief Noelle had expected, but something older and more complicated. The expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment long enough that the moment itself barely registered as new information. "Hey," Claire said. "Hey," Noelle said. "You look terrible," Claire said. "Cheekbone. I can see that." Claire looked at Elias with an expression of such pure, exhausted contempt that Noelle felt a complicated love for her that she didn't have the infrastructure to hold in this room. "Are we done with the theatrical portion of the evening?" "Sit with your sister," Elias said. His voice had a different quality now, tighter. The control was costing more. Claire sat beside Noelle on the couch. Their shoulders touched. Noelle felt Claire's arm against hers, solid, warm, present, and focused on that contact as the specific, physical fact of what she was here to protect. Elias sat back down across from them. "Now," he said, "let's talk about what happens next." She counted in her head. She'd been in the building 6 minutes. Lucien needed 9 more at minimum. She needed to hold the room for 9 more minutes. "The documentation," she said. "Let's talk about that first." He looked at her. "What about it?" "You've had 2 years to build it. I've had 1 night." She held his gaze. "And I have 9 pages of a handwritten account from the primary witness, cross-referenced with 17 physical receipts providing alibi documentation for every date you've attached my name to, signed and dated and already in the hands of a lawyer with considerably more institutional standing than anyone in your network." She paused. "How does your version of the documentation hold up against mine?" The room was quiet. "You're bluffing," he said. "I'm not," she said. "And you know I'm not because you've been watching me long enough to know I don't have the energy left for bluffs." She looked at him steadily. "The financial contacts are also having a different morning than you planned." "Both of them." His face changed, just slightly, just enough. The structure is gone, Elias, she said. What you built over 2 years is gone. What you're sitting in right now is a room with a woman you can't use anymore, and a situation that is going to require you to make a decision about what you actually want, because what you said you wanted is no longer available. He stood up. He was not loud. He was never loud. But the evenness was gone, and what replaced it was something that she recognized from the time before she'd understood what it was. The specific energy of a man whose control had been routed inward, compressing against itself, which was when he was at his most unpredictable. "You don't understand," he said, and his voice was tight in a way she'd only heard twice before, both times immediately before something physical happened. "What it cost me to I know exactly what it cost you," she said. "I was part of the cost." He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something happened in that look. Something that had not happened in all the years she'd known him, in the 2 years of running, in the hours of this night. She was not afraid. She was looking at him from the other side of the fear, from the place beyond it that she'd found somewhere between 9 pages of legal pad and a cold Brooklyn warehouse, and the sound of her sister's voice, and from that place he looked like what he actually was. A man who had spent enormous resources manufacturing the conditions of someone else's helplessness because his own was too much to examine. "This is over," she said. "You can decide what that costs you, or someone else can decide for you." The stairwell door at the far end of the hallway opened. 3 things happened in close succession. The man near the front door moved toward the hallway and was met with a speed and efficiency that produced a sound she didn't look toward. Elias turned toward the hallway door, and Claire grabbed Noelle's arm with both hands and held on. Elias turned back toward them. He had something in his hand. She registered it peripherally, small, the specific shape of a calculation that had gone to its last resort. She stood up. She put herself between him and Claire. She did it without deciding to, without calculating the geometry or the risk, just the body making the choice that the mind had been building toward since the moment she'd walked into this room. This was the thing, this specific position, herself standing between her sister and the source of the threat. This was what all of it had been about. "Put it down," she said. He looked at her. The thing in his hand did not move. "There are 4 people in the hallway," she said. "There are 2 more in the lobby. There is no version of what you're thinking right now that ends the way you want it to." His hand was not steady. This was new. In all the time she had known him, his hands had been steady. She watched the unsteadiness and understood it for what it was. Not weakness, but the specific tremor of a man who had run out of constructed options and was operating from something more fundamental than strategy. "Elias." She kept her voice level. She kept it the way she'd kept everything level in the past 9 hours, with the exhausted discipline of someone who had decided that steadiness was the last and most important thing she could offer. "It's over, but it doesn't have to be worse than over." "You took everything," he said. "You never had it," she said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. You had a performance of it, a version you constructed and maintained through force. That's not having something." His jaw worked. "Let someone make a worse decision for you," she said, "or make the better one yourself. Those are the options left." The hallway door opened fully. Lucian came through it. He took in the room in a single sweep, registered the positions, registered the thing in Elias's hand, and came to a stop 8 feet from Elias with the specific, contained stillness of someone who had done the calculation and arrived at a particular conclusion about the most economical path from the current moment to the desired outcome. He did not look at Noelle yet. He looked at Elias. "I think," Lucian said very quietly, "you know how this ends." Elias looked at him. He looked at Noelle. He looked at the thing in his hand, which was shaking more visibly now, the tremor of a performance finally unable to hold its own weight. He set it on the coffee table. He sat down in the chair behind him. He put his face in his hands. No one spoke for a moment. Then Lucian turned and looked at Noelle, and she saw in his face the same thing she'd felt a moment ago when she'd stood up from the couch. The aftermath, the specific depleted clarity of the other side of the impossible thing, the thing that looked like relief, but was deeper than relief, because relief was about the absence of something, whereas this was about the presence of something, some new condition she didn't have a word for yet. Claire's hand was still on her arm. "Okay," Claire said from directly behind her. Her voice was steady in the infuriating, beloved way it had always been. "Now will someone explain to me who the man in the Italian suit is?" Noelle laughed. It came out of her without warning, without permission, the real kind, the unguarded kind, the kind that had been captured through a restaurant window by a long lens, and a man with 2 years of patience and a plan that had just collapsed completely. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. It was the best 3 seconds of the past 2 years. She turned and put her arms around her sister. Claire held on. The man who had spent 2 years manufacturing her helplessness sat in a chair 8 feet away and said nothing, because there was nothing left for him to say. And outside the window of the 9th-floor corporate apartment, the city continued in the full, indifferent, continuous noise of a November morning, and it sounded, for the first time in a very long time, like something she was inside of rather than something she was surviving. Elias Crane was arrested at 9:17 that morning, not by people who owed him anything. The documentation that had been positioned through his contact in the DA's office was met, when it arrived, by a counterfiling from a lawyer whose institutional standing was, as Noelle had told Elias, considerably more significant. The two financial contacts had provided sworn statements through the night. The security employee who had been reconsidering his relationship with Elias's operation provided corroborating testimony about the surveillance, the planted staff, the 2-year campaign. The woman who had been presenting herself as Patrice Duval was located in a Newark extended stay hotel at 6 in the morning and made a decision, when presented with the scope of what she was facing, to cooperate in exchange for a reduced exposure. The legal process was not fast. It never was. But the architecture was sound, built from 9 pages of handwritten account and 17 gas station receipts, and the sworn testimony of people who had, for various reasons and at various costs, decided that the structure they'd been part of had run its course. Noelle sat through 3 interviews in the following 2 weeks. The first with investigators, the second with a victim's advocate she hadn't expected and didn't know how to receive, the third with a prosecutor who was thorough and humorless and precise in a way she found reassuring rather than cold. She told the account each time with the same detail, the same sequence, the same specificity she'd arrived at on the legal pad in the middle of the night. It did not get easier to tell, but it got more certain. Each telling reinforced the skeleton of it, the fact of it, the way it had happened regardless of anyone's preferred version. Claire stayed in New York for 10 days. She slept on the couch in a safe house whose address Noelle had on a keyring she kept in her coat pocket at all times, and she did not ask Noelle to explain everything immediately, and she did not perform the particular kind of supportive concern that Noelle had always found more exhausting than helpful. She just occupied the same space, made coffee, watched television, said ordinary things. She was, as she had always been, the most matter-of-fact person Noelle had ever known. On the 4th night, sitting on the couch with bad takeout and the television on low, Claire said, "The man in the Italian suit." "Lucien," Noelle said. "Right." Claire ate a piece of something. "Are you going to tell me about him?" Noelle looked at the television. "What do you want to know?" "Everything, obviously. But I'll start with, does he make you feel safe?" Noelle considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said, "not because he removes danger, because he doesn't pretend danger doesn't exist." Claire looked at her. "That's a weird answer." "It's the accurate one." Claire ate another piece of something. "Okay," she said. "Good enough." Lucien came to the safe house twice during those 10 days. He didn't stay long. He was dealing with the aftermath of what the night had cost his own infrastructure. Not dramatically, not in ways that were visible to anyone without the specific context to read them, but in the way that all significant action cost. Adjustments, renegotiations, the management of consequences that had arrived in the wake of a night where he'd prioritized one thing above the ordinary calculations. He never said the prioritization had been anything other than chosen. He never said it had been easy. The second time he came, Claire answered the door and looked at him for a moment, and then looked back at Noelle across the room. "I'm going to make coffee," Claire said, with the elaborate neutrality of someone removing themselves from a scene. She went to the kitchen. She ran the water loud enough that it provided something like privacy in a small space. Lucian sat across from Noelle. He looked at her face. The cheekbone had faded from yellow-purple to green-yellow, the last stage, already subsiding. He looked at it the way he'd looked at everything about her, directly, with the full weight of his attention, not managing the looking. Crane's lawyers are going to push for a delay in arraignment, he said. I know. It won't hold, but it'll be another 3-4 weeks before anything moves formally. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, which were folded on his knees, and then looked up at her. The name, he said. We need to address that. She looked at him. Noelle Hart is burned, he said. You know that. But the underlying problem, operating under a constructed identity, is something the prosecutor is going to want addressed before it becomes something Crane's defense uses. I know, she said. I spoke to the advocate about it. There's a legal process for identity restoration for people in documented flight situations. It's not fast, but it exists. I have a lawyer who specializes in it, he said. I have one too now, she said. The one you gave me. Something in his face shifted. She recognized it now. Had been learning to recognize it over the weeks, the small movement that was his version of the expression most people wore openly. Right, he said. Good. She looked at him. She said, Lucienne.
He looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it without managing the answer. He was still. The night you sent the key card, she said, before I came up, you'd already read his message, about the complication, about the leverage he thought he had on you. She held his gaze. Was there a version of that night where you made a different calculation? He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. She waited. For about 4 minutes, he said. I sat with it for 4 minutes. The version where the practical calculation, the one that protected my position, minimized the exposure, was the one I made. He looked at her. And then I didn't. Why? He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, Because you called me baby in a restaurant and you had no idea you'd done it. And I spent the following week trying to explain to myself why it mattered. And I couldn't. The safe house was very quiet. The water in the kitchen had stopped running. Claire was being very still somewhere on the other side of the wall. That's not a practical reason, Noelle said. No, Lucien agreed. It's not. She looked at her hands in her lap. She looked at the key ring she'd set on the table. 3 brass keys on a plain steel ring, worn at the edges, the kind of keys that opened things that mattered. She'd been carrying them since the morning in the warehouse. I need time, she said. Not for you specifically, for this. She gestured at herself, at the room, at the whole of the past month. To become something I understand before I attach it to anything else. I know, he said. I mean it. I know, he said again. I'm not asking for anything. She looked at him. You're just sitting here. Yes. In my safe house. Your safe house, he agreed. Something moved through her that was the closest thing to lightness she'd felt in longer than she could trace. She didn't perform it. She just let it be there, in the room, alongside everything else that was in the room. Okay, she said. He stayed another 20 minutes. They talked about nothing in particular. The legal timeline, the safe house's faulty heating, a book she'd taken from his bookshelf the morning after the warehouse and still had in her coat pocket because she'd been reading it on the occasions when sleep didn't come. He asked what she thought of it. She told him. He disagreed with her reading of the ending and explained why, and she told him he was wrong, and the disagreement was quiet and specific and entirely without performance, and that quality of it, the ease of disagreement without consequence, was something she sat with after he left. She had not had that in a very long time. Maybe, she thought, not ever. Claire appeared from the kitchen with 2 coffees, waited exactly long enough to be certain the door was fully closed, and sat down beside her. Well, Claire said. Don't, Noelle said. I was just going to say he seems... Don't. Careful, Claire finished, like someone who knows what things cost. Noelle looked at the coffee. She looked at her sister's profile, the familiar architecture of it, the specific way Claire held her jaw when she was thinking, which was their mother's jaw, which was a face she'd spent 2 years not allowing herself to think about because thinking about it meant feeling the distance in a way she couldn't afford. Yeah, she said. He is.
Claire handed her the coffee. They sat. 3 months later, Noelle's name, her real name, the one she'd been born with, the one she'd folded into a gym bag with $3,000 and a dead phone, was restored through a legal process that was undramatic and took place mostly through document filings and a single 20-minute court appearance where no one raised their voice. The prosecutor described the circumstances in terms that the record would carry forward: documented victim of sustained intimate partner abuse and coercive control, operating under constructed identity in the context of credible ongoing threat. The judge stamped the filing. That was all it took. She walked out of the courthouse on a February morning with Claire on one side and Lucien's lawyer on the other, and her own name restored to her by a bureaucratic process that had cost nothing except 2 years of her life and everything she'd built and rebuilt and lost and built again. And the cold air hit her face, and she stopped on the courthouse steps for a moment. She had her name back. She stood with that for a moment, the specific weight of it, the way it felt different from the outside than she'd expected. Not like recovery, not like return, but like something else. Like the name itself had changed by being put down and picked back up. Like it belonged to someone who had been through what she'd been through and was carrying it forward rather than someone trying to get back to the person she'd been before. That person was gone. She'd been gone for 2 years, or maybe longer, maybe since the beginning of Elias. This person, standing on courthouse steps in February, with her real name in her real pocket and her sister's shoulder against hers, was someone she was still in the process of meeting. She thought she might like her. The charitable foundation took another 4 months to establish. It operated quietly at first through connections Lucien provided and a structure Noelle designed herself, with input from the victim's advocate she'd worked with through the legal process, and 2 other women she'd met in that same process who had the specific competence of people who had survived something and decided to make the survival useful. The foundation helped women in documented flight situations access resources, legal, financial, identity-related, without requiring them to explain themselves to institutions that were not equipped to understand the specific texture of what they'd been through. She ran it from an office in a building that was not connected to Lucien publicly because she had made the decision that the work needed to stand on its own without the complications that came with his name. He agreed with this. He said so once and didn't raise it again. The first time she used the word "we" in the context of a decision they were making together, she didn't notice she'd done it. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He just answered the question she'd been asking about whether to expand the foundation's geographic scope with his usual focused specificity. But afterward, walking back from the restaurant where they'd been sitting across a table from each other with takeout containers and a spreadsheet between them, the most civilian scene she'd inhabited in longer than she could track, she thought about the word and let herself think about it without immediately managing the thinking. We. She'd said it like it was already true. Maybe it was. It was a Saturday evening in early May, the city doing what it did in May, the specific temporary grace of New York before summer, cool enough to walk without thinking about it, light lasting longer than it had any right to, the streets carrying the specific energy of people who had survived winter and were not yet tired of not winter. She walked home on the route that was her current route, the one she'd chosen herself, not from necessity but from preference, because it passed a bookstore that kept its light on late, and a coffee cart that made things correctly, and a small park she liked at this hour when the evening light came through it sideways. She had a name. She had an address that was hers, a lease in her own name, a door with one lock because one was enough. She had a foundation that was helping 7 women this month in ways that were specific and practical and grounded in things she understood from the inside. She had a sister who called on Tuesdays and had developed an inexplicable habit of leaving voicemails that began with weather reports from wherever she was, as if she understood that location was a form of love. She had a man who sat across tables from her with takeout containers and spreadsheets and argued with her reading of book endings and had never once, in all the months since the warehouse, asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was, which was someone still in the process of figuring out what that was. She stopped at the entrance to the small park. The light was exactly as she'd known it would be at this hour, coming through sideways, catching the new leaves at an angle that made them almost translucent, the specific green of May, temporary and full. She stood there for a moment. She thought about a word said in a restaurant. 2 syllables. An accident. The specific accident of a word surfacing from a buried life, rising through 2 years of careful construction, like something that had been held underwater finally reaching air. She thought about a man going still. She thought about what stillness meant in a person who had learned to hold everything controlled and continuous. What it cost and what it revealed when the stillness was not the stillness of management, but the stillness of something arrived at. She took her phone out of her pocket. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. No performance, just the word. "I'm in the park on 11th, she said. "The light is doing something." A pause. Then, "I'm 20 minutes away." "Okay," she said. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the park in the May light and waited, which was the thing she had not been able to do for 2 years. The simple, radical act of being in a place and expecting someone to arrive rather than expecting everything to fall apart. The waiting felt different from what she'd expected. It felt like something she had earned rather than something that had simply become available. The city moved around her. The light shifted the way light did, the way everything did. Not away from her, not from something, just forward, the way time moved when you were in it rather than ahead of it. She waited. He came. And the simple slip of the tongue that had started everything, that accidental, buried, unstoppable word, turned out to have been, in the end, not a mistake at all. Just the truth, arriving before she was ready, the way truth usually did.